In the long chronicle of global power, few moments were as transformative, or as quietly engineered behind the scenes, as the financial entanglement between the United States and the British Empire during the Second World War. This story, though overshadowed by the explosions of battlefields and the heroism of soldiers, actually begins not with tanks rolling across borders, but with banks, ledgers, and a nation reshaping its destiny through economic leverage. As the world plunged into chaos in 1939, the British Empire stood as a colossus burdened by vast territory, global responsibilities, and a rapidly draining economy. The empire was still mighty, stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent, but beneath its vast geography lay a fragile foundation, weakened by the immense costs of maintaining dominance through the Great Depression and the rising threat of fascism across Europe. Britain had the will to fight Hitler, but it did not have the money. And into this moment of vulnerability stepped a rising power, one that had been building its industries, strengthening its financial networks, and contemplating its long-term place in the world, the United States. When we trace the origins of America's ascent to global leadership, we often focus on Pearl Harbor, the atomic bomb, or the establishment of the United Nations. But the real pivot happened much earlier, in quiet meeting rooms in Washington and London, in negotiations over gold reserves, shipping rights, and wartime purchasing agreements. It happened when the world's greatest empire found itself forced to turn to a former colony for help, financial, industrial, and ultimately political. The story you are about to hear is not only about war, it is about economic dependency, geopolitical strategy, and a carefully orchestrated shift in global power that would shape the world for the next century. It is about how, through the mechanisms of loans, aid packages, and a policy known famously as Lend-Lease, the United States effectively bankrolled much of Britain's war effort, and in doing so, gained unprecedented influence over the future of global order. This documentary begins with a world on the brink. Europe is aflame, cities are falling one by one, and global shipping routes are threatened by German U-boats. Britain stands alone, desperately trying to buy weapons, raw materials, oil, and food, but its gold reserves are dwindling. In 1939, the British Empire imported more than it produced, and war accelerated this imbalance to catastrophic levels. Despite its proud tradition of self-reliance, Britain's economic survival depended on its ability to purchase supplies from America. Yet U.S. neutrality laws, and American public opinion, meant that direct involvement in the war was politically impossible. Still, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something critical. Helping Britain survive was not simply an act of charity, it was an investment in America's own security and future power, and so began one of the most remarkable financial maneuvers in modern history, one in which economic assistance was packaged as support for democracy, wrapped in the language of freedom, and sold to the American public as a moral obligation, while simultaneously advancing America's long-term strategic interests. The U.S. would not merely lend materials to Britain, it would restructure Britain's economic sovereignty. Roosevelt and his advisors recognized that the war represented a once-in-a-century opportunity to shift global financial power away from London and toward Washington. For nearly 200 years, the British pound sterling had been the world's dominant currency, supported by the vast reach of the empire and the influence of the City of London. But war changed everything. As Britain depleted its gold, sold off its foreign investments, and mortgaged its future, the pound fell, and the dollar rose. This documentary will take you through the intricate web of decisions, pressures, and negotiations that resulted in Britain losing not just financial independence, but also geopolitical dominance. We will explore how American policymakers crafted policies that appeared generous, even heroic, but ultimately positioned the U.S. as the new global creditor while reducing Britain's empire to a debtor state. We will look at how wartime loans, trade agreements, and the transfer of military equipment came with strings that would tighten once the war ended and Britain attempted to rebuild an empire it could no longer afford. This is the story of how superpowers are made, not simply through battles or conquests, but through economics, alliances, and the ability to dictate the terms of survival. By the end of this journey, you will understand how America's financial support not only saved Britain from collapse, but also ensured that the United States would emerge from World War II as the dominant global force, politically, militarily, and economically, while the British Empire entered a period of accelerated decline from which it would never recover. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration. In the chapters ahead, we will trace the origins of British financial vulnerability, uncover the key figures whose decisions shaped this new world order, analyze the turning points where economic dependency became irreversible, and examine the long-lasting aftermath that reshaped nations, collapsed empires, and established the modern global system as we know it. This is not simply the story of war. It is the story of money, the story of power, the story of how the United States bankrolled World War II, and in doing so, quietly orchestrated the decline of the British Empire. As Europe plunged into war in September 1939, the British Empire entered the conflict with the confidence of a nation that had, for centuries, stood at the apex of global influence. Yet beneath this outward assurance lay a stark and troubling reality. The British economic system, strained by years of depression, rearmament, and imperial maintenance, was not prepared for the scale or duration of the war that now confronted it. The beginning of this movement, this grand shift in global power, did not originate on a battlefield. It began quietly, within the halls of British financial institutions and American political offices, as a crisis of liquidity, currency, and survival. Britain could fight Hitler, but it could not afford to do so alone. And this fundamental truth would set into motion a chain of developments that forever changed the balance of power. To understand the roots of America's financial involvement, one must first appreciate the economic fragility of the British Empire at the outbreak of the war. Britain's global network, sprawling colonies, protectorates, and dominions, was in many ways the source of its strength, but also its economic Achilles heel. Maintaining and defending this vast empire required enormous financial resources, a powerful navy to protect sea lanes, a robust merchant fleet to move supplies, and a domestic economy capable of supporting wartime production. By 1939, Britain was already stretched thin. Decades of global commitments, combined with the blow of the Great Depression, had drained the empire's financial reserves. The treasury still held gold and foreign assets, but not enough to sustain a multi-year conflict against an industrialized opponent. The British leadership understood with increasing alarm that war with Germany would require far more than military courage. It would require immense expenditures on weapons, aircraft, fuel, and food, most of which could be obtained only from the United States. At this point, America stood as the world's premier industrial powerhouse, its factories humming and its economy rapidly recovering from the Depression. Whether Britain wanted help or not, the structural reality of global economics meant that only the United States could supply the goods necessary to withstand the German war machine. But turning to America for aid posed political and ideological challenges. Britain was the world's largest empire. To appear dependent on another country, especially a former colony, was, for many in the British establishment, unthinkable. Yet necessity left little room for pride. By late 1939, Britain began purchasing war materials from the U.S. on a massive scale: aircraft engines, steel, munitions, motor vehicles, and the increasingly vital petroleum that powered the Royal Navy. However, under U.S. neutrality laws, all purchases had to be made on a cash-and-carry basis. This meant Britain had to pay up front and transport the goods itself, an expensive requirement at a time when Nazi U-boats were stalking the Atlantic. Although Britain initially complied, drawing down its gold reserves and selling off foreign investments, the pace of spending became alarming. By early 1940, the Chancellor of the Exchequer warned that Britain was burning through its liquid assets at a rate that would soon become unsustainable. The empire's wealth was vast, but most of it was tied up in land, infrastructure, and long-term overseas holdings, not the liquid capital needed to sustain wartime trade. At this moment of looming financial exhaustion, the British leadership understood they needed more than a short-term purchasing strategy. They needed a partner. But securing American support would not be simple. The United States was deeply divided on the issue of intervention. A powerful isolationist movement, led in part by the America First Committee, fiercely opposed any involvement in European conflicts. Many Americans believed that the First World War had been a tragic mistake, a conflict that cost lives without delivering lasting peace. As Europe burned, a large portion of the American public insisted that the best course was to remain distant, neutral, and focused on domestic recovery. Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, saw matters differently. He recognized that the fall of Britain would leave America dangerously exposed to an unchallenged Nazi regime, one capable of threatening global stability, trade, and eventually American shores themselves. Still, Roosevelt could not openly declare support for the British war effort without risking political backlash. Instead, he employed a strategy of gradual persuasion, both to the American public and to Congress. The first step was emphasizing the moral and ideological stakes of the war, Britain was not merely a country fighting for its survival, it was the last major democracy in Europe resisting tyranny. If Britain fell, Roosevelt argued that America would stand alone in a world dominated by aggression and dictatorship. Through speeches, fireside chats, and press statements, he carefully constructed a narrative that framed aid to Britain not as foreign intervention, but as a necessary act of self-defense. Meanwhile, in Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and later Winston Churchill, sent increasingly urgent messages to Washington. British officials made their case plainly: they were running out of money, and without American support, they would not be able to sustain the war. This desperation led to a significant moment in December 1940, when the British government disclosed that it was nearly insolvent. Churchill himself admitted to Roosevelt that Britain could no longer pay for the supplies it desperately needed. This revelation marked the true beginning of the movement, the tipping point where financial necessity began transforming into geopolitical dependency. What followed was one of the most consequential policy shifts in American history: the creation of the Lend-Lease program. Proposed in early 1941, Lend-Lease allowed the United States to provide war materials to Britain without immediate payment. The idea, described by Roosevelt through his famous analogy of lending a neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire, shifted the financial burden of the war dramatically. No longer would Britain have to exhaust its gold reserves or sell off its foreign assets. Instead, the U.S. would extend credit, supply goods, and assume the role of primary financier of the Allied war effort. But Lend-Lease came with strings not immediately visible to the public, yet deeply consequential. In exchange for American aid, Britain agreed to dismantle certain imperial trade preferences and open its markets to U.S. influence. The once mighty British Empire, which had dominated global commerce for a century, now found itself gradually yielding economic control to Washington. This was not a simple act of generosity by the United States. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated rebalancing of global power. What began in this moment, the financial movement that bound Britain to the United States, was far more than wartime cooperation. It was the foundation of a new global order. America would bankroll Britain's survival, but in return, it would inherit the financial leadership of the world. If the economic crisis of Britain set the stage for a transformation of global power, it was the key figures on both sides of the Atlantic who shaped, negotiated, pushed, and sometimes resisted the emerging financial dependency between the British Empire and the United States. Their decisions, sometimes bold, sometimes reluctant, sometimes born from desperation, would determine not only the course of World War II, but the post-war world that followed. Behind every major policy and every financial agreement were individuals struggling to balance national interests with global realities. Their early struggles reveal a complex web of diplomacy, pressure, persuasion, and political maneuvering that helped propel the United States toward global leadership while simultaneously pulling Britain deeper into economic reliance. At the forefront of this story stands Winston Churchill, whose leadership style combined ferocious determination, eloquent rhetoric, and a deep historical awareness of Britain's precarious position. When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, Britain was already facing economic exhaustion, mass destruction from the Blitz, and the looming threat of invasion. Churchill understood immediately that Britain could not win the war alone. He also recognized that appealing to the United States would require more than strategic arguments. It would require a personal alliance with Franklin D. Roosevelt, one built on trust, persuasion, and the constant reminder that the fate of democracy itself hung in the balance. Churchill's early struggles were not only military, they were financial. He had to convince Roosevelt to circumvent American neutrality, overcome isolationist opposition, and commit the full industrial might of the United States to Britain's survival. Roosevelt, for his part, was equally significant. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, was a master of political navigation. Though sympathetic to Britain's plight, he was constrained by a Congress deeply wary of foreign entanglements. Early in the war, he walked a delicate line, encouraging public sympathy for Britain while avoiding direct military commitments that would provoke political backlash. He used metaphors, moral framing, and incremental policy shifts to move America closer to supporting the Allies. His fireside chats appealed not only to logic but to emotion, painting the Nazi threat as a storm that would eventually reach American shores if left unchecked. Roosevelt's struggle was internal: how to help Britain without appearing to violate neutrality, how to prepare the American public for the possibility of war, and how to transition the U.S. economy into the greatest industrial engine the world had ever seen. But Churchill and Roosevelt were not alone. There were others: strategists, advisors, bankers, and diplomats, who shaped the contours of the financial relationship. One such figure was John Maynard Keynes, the renowned British economist whose work had already transformed global economic theory. Keynes became a crucial advisor to the British Treasury during the war and played a central role in negotiating Lend-Lease terms. He understood the gravity of Britain's economic collapse more acutely than almost anyone else. Keynes warned early that Britain was rapidly approaching insolvency, and he traveled repeatedly to Washington to make the case for American support. His mission was both diplomatic and psychological. He needed to convince American officials that Britain was not asking for charity, but for a partnership essential to defeating fascism. Yet Keynes also understood the darker side of the arrangement. He feared that American financial pressure would eventually force Britain to dismantle its system of imperial trade, threatening its position as the world's dominant economic power. His early struggles foreshadowed the post-war reshaping of global finance. On the American side, one of Roosevelt's most influential advisors was Harry Hopkins, a figure often overshadowed in traditional histories, yet indispensable to the forging of the Anglo-American alliance. Hopkins served as Roosevelt's personal emissary, traveling to London in 1941 amid intense bombings to assess Britain's will to fight. What he witnessed, the devastation, the resilience, the desperation, convinced him that supporting Britain was not only necessary but urgent. Hopkins became the bridge between Roosevelt and Churchill, carrying messages, negotiating terms, and shaping the framework that would become Lend-Lease. His early struggles centered around pushing through resistance in Congress, countering isolationist criticism, and ensuring that the program was framed in a way Americans would accept. Without Hopkins' advocacy, the U.S.-British partnership would have been far more fragile. Among the figures shaping American economic strategy was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was deeply concerned about the consequences of financing a long war, both for the U.S. economy and for the future balance of power. He advocated strict oversight of British finances, insisting that the U.S. should not merely give aid without ensuring long-term strategic advantages. To Morgenthau, Britain's financial desperation was an opportunity, one that could reshape global economics in favor of the United States. His insistence on detailed financial disclosures from Britain reflected a shift in power. For the first time in modern history, the world's most powerful empire was opening its books to another nation. Meanwhile, Britain's economic bureaucracy was strained to its breaking point. The Bank of England, led at the time by Governor Montague Norman, faced the daunting task of liquidating foreign assets rapidly enough to meet wartime payments. Norman struggled with the emotional toll of selling British investments that had taken generations to accumulate. Each sale, whether of American real estate, foreign stock holdings, or gold, represented another step toward dependency. The loss of these assets weakened Britain's post-war economic prospects and increased U.S. leverage. Diplomatically, the British ambassador to the United States, Lord Lothian, also played a crucial role. In November 1940, just weeks before the Lend-Lease proposal, Lothian made an extraordinary statement that shocked both nations. Britain, he admitted candidly, was broke. His public revelation was not a misstep, it was a calculated move to pressure Washington. In exposing Britain's insolvency, Lothian raised the stakes and accelerated discussions for American support. But his announcement also exposed Britain's vulnerability to the world, signaling that the empire was no longer financially invincible. Even within Britain, not everyone agreed on the extent of the danger or the wisdom of relying so heavily on the United States. Some members of Parliament, particularly imperial traditionalists, feared that accepting American aid would erode Britain's sovereignty. They warned that Washington would demand political concessions or impose economic conditions that would weaken the imperial system. Their concerns, largely dismissed during the chaos of war, would later prove prophetic. The early struggles of these figures reveal a deeper truth: the movement that would eventually shift global dominance from Britain to the United States was not inevitable. It was negotiated, crafted, debated, contested. Individuals shaped the policies that bound the two nations together, but they also clashed over priorities, fears, and visions of the post-war world. As the war intensified, these struggles became even more pronounced. Churchill fought to preserve Britain's dignity while begging for resources. Roosevelt fought to lead America toward intervention without appearing to drag the nation into foreign conflict. Advisors like Keynes, Hopkins, and Morgenthau fought battles behind the scenes, over numbers, contracts, shipping rights, interest rates, and trade conditions. These were not merely bureaucratic disputes. They were the early fractures in an empire already under stress. They were the negotiations that would decide whether Britain would emerge from the war as a co-equal power or as a nation diminished in wealth, influence, and global reach. And as these figures fought their early battles, a dramatic turning point approached, one that would seal Britain's dependence and accelerate America's rise. Every historical transformation has a single moment, an inflection point, where the balance tips, where momentum shifts, where what once seemed temporary becomes permanent. In the story of how the United States bankrolled World War II and quietly set into motion the decline of the British Empire, that turning point arrived with stunning clarity in early 1941. It was a moment defined not by a battlefield victory or a political proclamation, but by a stark financial reality that forced Britain to confront a truth it had never imagined: the world's greatest empire was bankrupt. This confrontation would push Britain irreversibly into America's financial embrace and reshape the global order. Throughout 1940, Britain's economic situation deteriorated rapidly. Despite Churchill's unwavering resolve and the nation's heroic resistance during the Blitz, British finances were collapsing under the weight of wartime expenditures. The empire's gold reserves, once symbols of global prestige, had been shipped across the Atlantic and melted down to pay for American supplies. British-owned stocks, bonds, and assets in North America were sold off at discounted prices. Even imperial holdings, plantations, mines, and infrastructure were being leveraged or liquidated. This quiet dismantling of Britain's wealth was invisible to the public but deeply alarming to officials. Behind closed doors, the British Treasury issued warnings that the country could no longer maintain its rate of spending. By December 1940, the government concluded that by early spring, Britain simply would not be able to pay for the war. The turning point arrived on December 8, 1940, when Churchill sent Roosevelt a letter of profound significance. The message was blunt: Britain was out of money. Churchill, whose speeches inspired millions, wrote with unusual vulnerability as he explained that without immediate financial assistance, Britain would soon be unable to buy weapons, food, aircraft, and raw materials from the United States. This was not merely a request for help, it was an admission of national insolvency. Churchill was effectively acknowledging that the British Empire, which had dominated global finance for centuries, could no longer fund its own survival. Roosevelt understood the magnitude of this moment. For months, he had been maneuvering politically, preparing the American public for increased involvement in the war. But Churchill's letter crystallized the stakes: if Britain collapsed economically, it might be forced into negotiation with Hitler. The consequences for the United States, and the world, would be catastrophic. A Nazi-dominated Europe would control the Atlantic, threaten American trade routes, and shift global power toward authoritarianism. The United States could not allow Britain to fall, yet it could not openly break neutrality by declaring war. The solution was Lend-Lease, a program that would become the financial turning point of the war and the decisive step in America's rise to global dominance. Proposed by Roosevelt in January 1941 and passed by Congress in March, the Lend-Lease Act effectively allowed the U.S. to supply Britain with weapons, supplies, ships, fuel, and critical materials without requiring immediate payment. Britain would receive what it needed and repay later in kind, a deliberately vague phrase that concealed the deeper implications of the agreement. Roosevelt framed the policy with his famous analogy: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a hose, you lend it to him. The metaphor was brilliant. It allowed Americans to view the policy not as foreign entanglement, but as common sense. Yet the reality was far more complex. Lend-Lease was not simply a loan. It was a financial revolution. For the first time, the United States would bankroll another nation's war effort on an unprecedented scale. The turning point was not just that Britain accepted American financing, it was that Britain had no choice. Lend-Lease erased the last illusion of British financial independence. By removing the requirement to pay up front, America gained immense leverage over British strategy, procurement, and long-term economic policy. Every ship launched, every tank deployed, every convoy sent across the Atlantic tied Britain more closely to the United States. This was no longer a partnership of equals. It was a relationship between a creditor and a debtor, one whose consequences would ripple far beyond the war. Financial dependency quickly expanded into strategic dependency. American factories, operating at full capacity, began producing war goods for Britain at a scale the British industrial system could no longer match. U.S. shipyards replaced the merchant vessels lost to German U-boats. American agricultural production fed the British home front. American oil fueled the Royal Navy. Without these supplies, Britain's war effort would have collapsed. Churchill recognized this, famously declaring that Lend-Lease was the most unsorted act in history. Yet beneath the praise was an acknowledgement of Britain's permanent shift into reliance on American support. Another key aspect of the turning point came through the secret conditions attached to Lend-Lease. Although seldom discussed publicly, American policymakers insisted on crucial economic concessions that weakened Britain's imperial trade system. For decades, Britain had maintained preferential trade agreements within its empire, agreements that locked colonies into buying British goods and selling resources to British markets. This system sustained the pound sterling and underpinned the empire's economic strength. But the U.S. viewed imperial preference as protectionist and incompatible with its own vision of global free trade. Washington made clear to London, if you want American money, you must begin dismantling the economic foundations of your empire. Thus, Lend-Lease was not merely wartime aid, it was the beginning of the end of Britain's economic dominance. The British leadership understood that accepting these terms would weaken their post-war position, but they had no alternative. Saving the nation today meant sacrificing the empire tomorrow. The turning point deepened further after June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The Allies desperately needed to keep the Soviets in the fight, and once again, the United States became the indispensable supplier. With American factories now supporting not just Britain but also the Soviet war effort, the U.S. became the central industrial artery of the Allied cause. This newfound centrality shifted political power dramatically. Whereas Britain had once been the senior partner in global alliances, it was now eclipsed. Washington increasingly dictated strategy, production priorities, and logistical planning. By the time the U.S. formally entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the turning point had already occurred. America was not merely entering a war, it was stepping into a leadership role it had already been quietly constructing through financial and industrial dominance. Britain, though still proud and militarily resilient, was now irreversibly dependent. What makes this moment so decisive is that it permanently altered the financial hierarchy of the world. The British pound sterling, the cornerstone of global finance for over a century, was dethroned by the US dollar as the dominant currency of trade and reserves. London, once the heartbeat of global banking, found itself overshadowed by New York. Wall Street, not the City of London, would guide the post-war economic order. This shift, born in the darkest years of the war, was not immediately visible to civilians. To them, Lend-Lease seemed an enormous act of generosity. But to policymakers and economists, the writing on the wall was unmistakable. The United States had become the world's superpower, and Britain, indebted and depleted, would emerge from the war diminished. The turning point of 1941 was not just about survival. It was about transformation. In choosing to accept American financing, Britain saved itself from collapse, but surrendered the ability to shape the post-war world as it once had. Lend-Lease was the hinge on which empires turned. By the mid-years of the Second World War, the alliance between the United States and the British Empire reached its peak, an intense period marked by triumphs, tensions, and the undeniable reality that the balance of power had shifted. What began as a financial lifeline had evolved into a partnership in which Britain, once the unrivaled global hegemon, now found itself increasingly overshadowed by the sheer industrial, economic, and logistical might of the United States. This era, roughly spanning 1942 to 1944, captures both the high point of Allied cooperation and the moment when Britain fully confronted the consequences of its growing dependency. The challenges that emerged during this period were not only military, they were political, strategic, and deeply symbolic of the empire's diminishing influence. The peak of the war was also the peak of Britain's realization that victory would come at the price of power, prestige, and independence. As American production reached unprecedented levels, the U.S. home front transformed into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once built cars and appliances now churned out tanks, aircraft, artillery, and naval vessels at a rate the world had never seen. In 1941, the United States had produced a mere 3,000 aircraft. By 1944, it produced nearly 100,000 annually. This industrial explosion dwarfed the capabilities of Britain, which, though resilient, was strained by bombings, resource shortages, and an economy that had already been stretched to its limits before the war even began. Lend-Lease shipments poured across the Atlantic in massive convoys: food, ammunition, locomotives, trucks, medical supplies, clothing, raw materials, and the steel and fuel that powered every aspect of the war effort. For Britain, this was salvation. Yet with every ship that arrived, British dependence deepened. Military strategy became another domain where America's rising dominance was unmistakable. As U.S. troops flooded into the European and Pacific theaters, American commanders increasingly assumed leadership roles in planning operations. While Britain had been the primary force resisting Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941, by 1943 the United States had overtaken it in troops deployed, equipment supplied, and influence over strategic decision-making. Nowhere was this more evident than in the debates leading up to the invasion of Normandy. Churchill favored a Mediterranean strategy, aiming to strike through Italy and the Balkans. Roosevelt and his generals, George C. Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower, insisted on a direct cross-channel invasion to liberate Western Europe. The American view prevailed. This shift was not simply about military logic, it was about weight, industrial weight, manpower weight, and financial weight. With the United States funding most of the Allied war effort, its voice carried the greatest authority, yet this growing imbalance also sowed seeds of tension. For centuries, Britain had been accustomed to leading global coalitions, defining international strategy, and managing imperial interests without challenge. Now, British leaders found themselves frequently overridden or sidelined. Churchill, though respected and admired by Roosevelt, struggled internally with the realization that Britain was no longer the senior partner. His stirring speeches and tireless diplomacy could not change the emerging arithmetic of power. Britain needed the United States far more than the United States needed Britain. As the war peaked, so did Britain's financial challenges, which only grew more severe beneath the surface of military cooperation. Lend-Lease was incredibly generous in appearance, but it did not cover all expenses. Britain still had to pay for many items, including civilian goods, transportation costs, and certain categories of equipment. Meanwhile, the empire's shrinking reserves were further strained by rising global commitments, from North Africa to Burma to the Atlantic Naval Campaign. The British government was borrowing aggressively, rationing intensely, and controlling nearly every aspect of domestic production. Inflation pressures grew, shipping shortages persisted, and despite the massive influx of American goods, Britain's economy became increasingly fragile. This fragility revealed itself in a crucial challenge: the erosion of Britain's imperial trade system. American policymakers, particularly Secretary of State Cordell Hull, believed deeply in global free trade and were determined to dismantle the British system of imperial preference, which gave special advantages to goods produced within the empire. U.S. officials argued that such policies were outdated remnants of colonialism and harmful to post-war recovery. But Britain saw things differently. Imperial trade was the economic backbone of the empire. Without it, the imperial system was unsustainable. Yet the conditions of Lend-Lease pressured Britain to make concessions that weakened its commercial advantages. In 1942, key British negotiators reluctantly agreed to the Anglo-American Mutual Aid Agreement, whose Article 7 committed Britain to reducing trade barriers after the war. While the wording was deliberately vague, the intent was clear: the empire would not be able to rebuild its pre-war economic dominance. Beyond economics, the British Empire faced mounting political challenges as well. War brought not only destruction but also growing demands for independence across colonial territories. India, long the crown jewel of the empire, erupted with calls for self-rule, culminating in the Quit India movement of 1942. Colonial troops serving under the British flag began to question why they fought for freedoms denied to them at home. American officials, many of whom viewed colonialism as incompatible with democratic ideals, applied additional pressure on Britain to consider post-war reforms. Roosevelt himself privately expressed impatience with British imperialism, especially in Asia. Churchill, fiercely protective of the empire, resisted these pressures, but the economic realities of the war left Britain with little leverage. Another challenge came from the sheer scale of American presence on British soil. By 1943, more than 1 million U.S. troops were stationed in the United Kingdom. American uniforms, American wealth, and American cultural influence became part of everyday life. The British public was grateful for this support, but its presence was a daily reminder that Britain was no longer acting alone. In ports, pubs, barracks, and airfields, the dynamic between the two nations was unmistakable. The United States was the ascending power, and Britain was increasingly dependent. As Allied victories accumulated in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific, the full scope of Britain's wartime sacrifices became clear. Cities lay in ruins, industries were struggling, and the national debt had skyrocketed to levels unimaginable before the war. Meanwhile, the United States emerged stronger, wealthier, and more industrially capable than ever. The contrast was stark. Britain was winning the war but losing its empire. America was winning the war and becoming the new world leader. The peak of the Allied war effort was therefore also the peak of Britain's post-imperial crisis. The challenges faced during this period, military, economic, political, and psychological, signaled a profound transformation. Britain had not yet accepted that the war would end with a new global hierarchy, but the truth was unavoidable. The world that would emerge after 1945 would be shaped by American power, American money, and American influence. This period set the foundations for the post-war order, and for the dramatic aftermath that would follow. The guns of the Second World War eventually fell silent in 1945, but for Britain, the end of combat did not bring the return of global power. Instead, it revealed the full consequences of 6 years of economic strain, massive borrowing, and the irreversible shift in global influence. The aftermath of the war was not simply a reconstruction period, it was the moment when the British Empire, weakened by debt and dependent on American support, began its rapid decline. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the conflict not only victorious, but economically supercharged, politically dominant, and positioned to shape the world for generations. The war had not only redrawn borders, it had rewritten the hierarchy of nations. The economic victory of the United States was as decisive as any military triumph, and the war's financial architecture ensured that the post-war world would revolve around American power. When victory was declared in Europe and the Pacific, Britain faced a sobering reality. It had contributed heroically to the war effort, but at a devastating cost. The empire was bankrupt. The nation's gold reserves were depleted, its foreign investments gone, and its industries damaged by bombings and overextension. Instead of emerging as a rejuvenated imperial power, Britain found itself with one of the largest national debts in its history, much of it owed to the United States. Lend-Lease, which had saved Britain during the war, vanished abruptly in September 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender. The American government ended the program without warning, immediately plunging the British economy into crisis. The sudden termination was a powerful reminder: Britain was no longer in control of its destiny. In desperation, the British government sought a massive peacetime loan from the United States. The negotiations were humiliating. Led by the economist John Maynard Keynes, the British delegation hoped to secure generous terms that would give the empire breathing room. But the U.S., aware of its newfound leverage, imposed strict conditions. The resulting Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 provided Britain with $3.75 billion, but with an interest rate, a firm repayment schedule, and a requirement that Britain dismantle much of its imperial trade system and make the pound sterling fully convertible to dollars. These conditions were crippling. When sterling convertibility was attempted in 1947, it triggered a financial crisis within weeks, forcing Britain to suspend the policy. The empire's economic foundation had cracked beyond repair. The British people, exhausted from years of war and rationing, hoped for a swift return to normal life. But instead they faced austerity, shortages, and prolonged economic hardship. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. Meanwhile, the United States, its homeland untouched by wartime destruction, experienced an unprecedented economic boom. American industry expanded, American banks dominated the global financial system, and American corporations spread across the world. The dollar replaced the pound as the international reserve currency. The center of global commerce shifted from London to New York. This was not simply a recovery, it was a transformation. The United States had become the financial heart of the post-war world. Britain's imperial power also unraveled rapidly in the aftermath. Once the economic foundation weakened, the political structure of the empire could no longer hold. Nationalist movements surged across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, fueled by wartime sacrifices and the promise of self-determination. India, the most valuable colony of the empire, gained independence in 1947. This was a symbolic blow from which Britain would never recover. The partition of India and Pakistan, violent, massive, and tragic, signaled to the world that the era of European empires was ending. Over the next 2 decades, one colony after another achieved independence, often amid upheaval and conflict. The empire that had once dominated a quarter of the world's population dissolved with stunning speed. The United States, meanwhile, stepped into the vacuum left by Britain's retreat. Through the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Bretton Woods institutions, and its global military presence, the U.S. established itself as the leader of the Western world. Britain, though still influential, became a junior partner in the new American-led order. This special relationship, forged during the war, endured, but not as a partnership of equals. Britain was now tethered to the U.S. economically, militarily, and strategically. What made this shift so profound was that it was not engineered through conquest or overt dominance, but through economic necessity and strategic design. The United States had bankrolled Britain's survival during the war, but the price was the reconfiguration of global power. American policymakers envisioned a world rooted in free trade, open markets, and the primacy of the dollar, and Britain, stripped of its imperial protections, had no choice but to accept this new reality. The aftermath of World War II also reshaped Britain domestically. The Labour government elected in 1945 embarked on a sweeping social reform program, nationalising industries, and creating the modern welfare state. These measures transformed British society, but they also added to the economic burden the nation carried. The post-war decades were marked by a struggle for recovery, deindustrialization, and repeated financial crises. Each downturn further constricted Britain's international role. By contrast, the United States grew stronger through the Cold War. Its economy expanded, its military bases encircled the globe, and its cultural and technological influence penetrated every corner of the world. Washington became the central hub of international diplomacy, economics, and defense. The global institutions created after the war, the IMF, World Bank, and United Nations, reflected American priorities and reinforced American leadership. Although Britain maintained a seat at the table, it no longer shaped the agenda. One of the most symbolic moments of Britain's diminished power came in 1956, during the Suez Crisis. When Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt, the United States vehemently opposed the intervention. President Eisenhower demanded an immediate withdrawal and threatened economic retaliation. Britain complied within days. The crisis exposed a stark truth: Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage if the United States disapproved. It was the clearest sign yet that the age of British imperial dominance had ended. Yet despite the decline, the legacy of the British Empire lingered, in culture, language, political institutions, and global networks. And while Britain no longer ruled vast territories, it adapted, forming the Commonwealth and maintaining a significant, though reduced, role in international affairs. But its position was now fundamentally different. The empire that once shaped the world had become a mid-level power in a world shaped by the United States. The impact of America's wartime financial support was therefore far-reaching. It not only changed the outcome of World War II, it changed the architecture of modern civilization. The U.S. became the dominant global power, the architect of the global financial system, and the center of Western alliances. Meanwhile, Britain transitioned from empire to nation-state, from world leader to partner, from creditor to debtor. In the end, the aftermath of World War II was not simply a story of victory and defeat. It was the story of transformation, of how financial dependency reshaped empires, how economic policy became a tool of geopolitical strategy, and how the United States emerged as the superpower of the modern era. In the grand sweep of world history, few transformations are as dramatic or as consequential as the shift in global power that took place during and after the Second World War. What began as a desperate plea for assistance evolved into a complete restructuring of the international system. Britain, the empire upon which the sun famously never set, had been the political, economic, and naval center of the modern world for centuries. But by 1945, the forces of war, debt, and shifting geopolitical realities had fractured its foundations. The United States, once a young republic across the Atlantic, had risen to replace it, not through conquest or imperial expansion, but through financial strength, industrial capacity, and geopolitical opportunity. The story of how the U.S. bankrolled World War II and set into motion the decline of the British Empire is therefore not merely a chapter of wartime diplomacy, it is the story of how the modern world was born. As we reflect on these events, it becomes clear that the transformation was not accidental. It was the product of long-term structural trends accelerated by the pressures of global conflict. Britain entered the war with immense prestige but fragile finances. It commanded vast territory, yet lacked the liquid capital needed to sustain a modern, industrial war. The empire's trade system, built on preferential markets and colonial extraction, was not equipped to compete with the sheer scale of American industrial production. The United States, in contrast, possessed abundant resources, expanding industries, and the world's greatest manufacturing capacity. While Britain was defending its empire with everything it had, the U.S. was building the economic foundation of the post-war era. Throughout this documentary journey, we have traced the evolution of this imbalance, from early shortages and desperate diplomacy to the vast machinery of Lend-Lease and the eventual reordering of global power. What emerges is a story not only of governments and policies, but of individuals whose decisions shaped the fate of nations. Roosevelt's careful strategy, Churchill's unshakable leadership, Hopkins' personal diplomacy, Keynes's warnings, Morgenthau's financial engineering, each played a role in forging the alliance that saved Britain from collapse while simultaneously reshaping the global hierarchy. Yet the turning point came not from intentions, but from realities. Britain did not plan to surrender its economic independence, it was forced to buy the arithmetic of war. The United States did not initially seek global dominance, the collapse of European power made it inevitable. The world that emerged in 1945 was one in which old empires faded and new institutions arose, institutions funded, designed, and directed by American power. Bretton Woods established the dollar as the central reserve currency. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe under American guidance. NATO anchored Western defense to Washington's leadership. In each of these developments, we see the legacy of wartime finance. The United States had provided the material lifeline, and in return it now shaped the peace. For Britain, the post-war years were a period of reckoning. Though victorious, the empire discovered the limits of victory. Economic strain, colonial uprisings, and political shifts forced the gradual dismantling of imperial rule. Independence movements spread from India to Africa to the Caribbean, accelerated by the recognition that Britain no longer possessed the financial or military strength to maintain global control. Meanwhile, economic crises, such as the 1947 convertibility disaster and the repeated devaluations of the pound, demonstrated how deeply Britain's fate was now tied to American financial systems. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked the final symbolic blow. When Britain defied American policy, it was swiftly reminded that it no longer possessed the autonomy to shape world events alone. The age of empire had ended, but this decline was not simply a tragedy, it was a transformation. Britain reinvented itself as a democratic nation-state, a cultural and diplomatic power rather than a territorial empire. It helped build the institutions of the post-war world, partnered closely with the United States, and remained influential in global affairs. And although it no longer commanded an empire, Britain continued to play a central role in shaping Western values, global governance, and international cooperation. The United States, meanwhile, entered a new era, not only as a superpower, but as the architect of the modern global order. Its financial support during the war created a durable network of influence built on currency strength, economic aid, and military alliances. American corporations spread across continents. American culture, movies, music, fashion, and technology became global phenomena. American universities attracted the world's brightest minds. The dollar became the backbone of the international economy. All of this can be traced back to the moment Britain turned to the US for help, a moment that shifted the geopolitical axis of the world, and yet, it is important to recognize that the story is not one of domination, but of interdependence. This special relationship forged during the darkest days of the war endured long after the conflict ended. Britain remained one of America's closest allies, sharing intelligence, military cooperation, and political alignment. The two nations, once adversary and empire, became partners in shaping the global fight for democracy during the Cold War and beyond. Their relationship evolved from hierarchy to collaboration, from dependency to strategic partnership. As we look back at this sweeping transformation, one truth becomes clear: World War II was not only a military struggle, it was an economic revolution. Finance, debt, trade, and industrial capacity determined the victors as much as soldiers and generals. The American decision to bankroll Britain's war effort shaped the entire trajectory of the 20th century. Without U.S. support, Britain might have fallen. Without Britain's resistance, the United States might have faced a far more dangerous world. Their fates were intertwined, and through their alliance the world was remade. Today, the legacy of these events still shapes international politics. The dollar remains dominant. American influence remains global. Britain plays a leading, though no longer commanding, role on the world stage. And the post-war order, imperfect, contested, yet enduring, still reflects the choices made during the financial crucible of World War II. This is the story of how a global crisis accelerated a shift in power that had been building for decades. A story of how money, not merely armies, determines the fate of nations. A story of how the United States bankrolled a war, and in doing so, inherited the mantle of global leadership. It is a story of decline and ascent, of sacrifice and strategy, of the end of one empire and the rise of another, and above all, it is a story of how the modern world came to be.